I crashed into an alien princess. Now the galaxy says I'm the father of a royal child. The collision alarm went off 3 seconds before I hit her. 3 seconds. That is not enough time to do anything meaningful. I had just enough time to slam the emergency brake, feel the engines scream against each other in protest, and then the nose of my freighter, the Halcyon Drift, punched straight through the side of what turned out to be one of the most expensive ships in the known galaxy. The impact threw me sideways out of my chair. My shoulder hit the instrument panel hard enough that I heard something crack, and I was not entirely sure if that was the panel or me. It was the panel. The lights went red immediately. The cabin filled with the smell of overheated circuits. The ship groaned around me like it was angry at me personally, which, to be fair, was a reasonable response. I pulled myself upright. I checked my nose for blood. None. I checked my vision. Clear. I ran a fast internal inventory. Head, neck, shoulder sore but moving, ribs complaining but not broken, legs functional. I had been in enough rough situations to know the difference between bruised and broken, and I was bruised. Then I looked through the cracked viewport and saw what I had done. The other ship was roughly twice the size of mine. It was shaped like a crescent moon turned sideways, built from some kind of pale silver material that glowed faintly even while half of it was currently crumpled against my hull. It was a beautiful ship, and it was a ruined ship, and both of those things were entirely my fault. The collision had punched a gap through its midsection that I could see directly into, emergency lighting flickering orange behind the breach. I ran a damage scan. My ship was bad. The other ship was worse. The emergency docking corridor between the two hulls had sealed automatically on impact, which meant I was now physically attached to the vessel I had just destroyed, and I could not pull away even if I wanted to. I stood up. I grabbed my tool belt out of habit, the way you grab a coat before going outside, not because you have decided to need it, but because it belongs on your body when you are moving into an unknown situation. I walked to the connecting hatch and opened it. My name is Carter Wells. I am 34 years old. I have been a freelance deep space cargo hauler for 11 years. I run independent contracts, mostly medical supplies and technical components for research stations in the outer map systems. I fly alone. I prefer it that way. The Halcyon Drift is not a beautiful ship, but it is functional and it is mine. And in 11 years of flying into difficult places, I have never once collided with another vessel. That record was finished now. The corridor on the other side of the hatch was dark except for emergency lighting, a dim blue glow running along the floor panels that made everything look like the bottom of a deep ocean. Ceiling panels had fallen. A support beam had snapped and hung at an angle. The floor tilted slightly to the left, which meant structural integrity was already compromised and would continue to deteriorate. I did not have a great deal of time. I heard a sound, sharp and controlled, the kind of intake of breath that someone makes when they are in pain and are working very hard to contain how much. I moved toward it. That is simply what you do when someone is hurt. You go toward the sound. She was in what I would later learn was the ship's command chamber. A large circular room with screens on every wall, most of them dark now, and a central console that had partially collapsed. She was pinned under a section of fallen wall paneling, not buried completely, but pressed down with enough weight that moving on her own was not possible. The panel was roughly 3 meters long and made of something denser than it looked. She was tall. Even lying on her side I could tell she was tall, longer-limbed than any human I had met. Her skin was a pale silver blue, the same shade as the exterior of her ship, as though the vessel had been built to match its owner. Her hair was the color of deep ocean water, dark and faintly luminescent, moving slightly even though there was no draft in the chamber. Her eyes, when they opened and found me, were a color I did not have a precise word for. Not gold, not amber. Something that lived between the two, warm and sharp at the same time, and currently focused on me with an intensity that I felt across the room. She spoke. The words were precise and structured, a language I did not recognize, with a cadence that sounded like questions layered inside each other. I said, I cannot understand you yet. I am going to get this panel off you. Do not move. I assessed the panel quickly. Lifting from the center would be inefficient and would risk shifting debris onto her further. Lifting from the near edge and pivoting the panel away was the better approach. I braced, got my hands under the edge, and pushed upward. My back lodged an immediate complaint. I kept pushing until the panel had shifted enough for her to pull herself free. She moved carefully and deliberately, testing each limb before committing weight to it, checking herself the way trained people check themselves after impacts, methodically and without panic. She found the damage on her left side, a deep bruise already darkening through the thin material of her suit. She pressed her palm against it and breathed slowly, managing the pain the way disciplined people manage it, not eliminating it but assigning it a space where it would not affect her thinking. Then she looked at me again. The look was not grateful. It was not hostile either. It was the specific expression of someone who has encountered something outside their prepared categories and is running a rapid analysis of what to do about it. I had seen that look on scientists when an experiment produced a result they had not predicted. Not alarmed, not satisfied, working. She spoke again, different words this time shorter, a command structure by the sound of it. I said, my translator is not picking up your language. I am Carter Wells. My ship hit yours. I am very sorry about that. I am going to understand exactly how it happened, but right now I want to make sure you are not seriously injured. She looked at me steadily. Then she reached up and touched something just behind her right ear, a small flat device barely visible against her skin, the size of a thumbnail. She pressed it twice with deliberate precision. When she spoke again, I understood every word. She said, "You are human." I said, "Yes." She said, "This is the Velthari exclusion zone." I said, "I was not aware of that. My navigation charts showed this corridor as open passage." She said, "Your charts are wrong. This zone has been closed to unregistered vessels for 400 cycles." I said, "That is a significant period of time for nobody to update the navigation database." She looked at me, a long, assessing look. Then she said, carefully, quietly, in the tone of someone communicating something that is both factual and significant and also somehow absurd, "I am Princess Elindra Varsal of the Velthari Sovereign Compact." I said, "I am sorry about your ship." The silence after that had real weight, the kind of silence that forms when the universe has shifted and neither party has yet fully absorbed the new configuration. She said, "You are sorry about my ship." I said, "And about your side. That bruise looks serious. Do you have a medical kit accessible somewhere I can reach?" She did not answer immediately. She was still running the calculation, and I had the sense that the results I was producing did not fit her expected output categories, which was making the calculation take considerably longer than usual. She said, "Do you understand what you have done?" I said, "I crashed into your vessel in a restricted zone while carrying a cargo manifest for a research station 6 sectors distant. Yes, I understand that is serious. I intend to take full responsibility for every aspect of it." She said, "That is not what I mean." She reached out then, not aggressively, deliberately and precisely the way she did everything. She placed 2 fingers against the left side of my neck just below the jaw. I held still because her expression made it clear this mattered and I did not have enough information yet to make a useful objection. I felt something through her fingertips, not pain, a vibration, low and steady, that moved through my skin and traveled inward somewhere and then stopped. Her expression changed. For the first time, something moved behind those gold-amber eyes that was not analysis. It was something older, the specific quality of a person who has just realized that the situation they are standing in has moved entirely outside any framework they were prepared for. She withdrew her hand. She said, "The resonance event. When the ships collided, You were within proximity range when the biometric shock passed between hulls. I said, I do not know what that means. She said, I know you do not. She stood then, slowly but completely, and with posture that does not come from instruction. It comes from a lifetime of being understood, without question, as the most important person in whatever room you enter. Even with a bruised side and falling debris and emergency lighting turning everything blue, she was entirely composed. She said, my child's first witnessed soul has been recorded. The resonance event registered your biosignature at the moment of biometric shock. Under Valthari foundational law, the individual whose biosignature is registered during a resonance witnessing is the paternal witness of record. The record is permanent and cannot be altered. The silence this time was entirely mine. I processed the statement. I processed it again. I said, I want to be completely clear about what happened. I did not do anything intentional. I collided with your spaceship because my navigation charts are approximately 11 years out of date. She said, I understand that. The record does not distinguish between intentional and incidental witnessing. The biometric data exists in the record. The law does not provide flexibility on this point. I said, is there any appeal mechanism? Some kind of formal process for contested situations? She said, there is the Solvari, but that is not something you would want. I said, what is the Solvari? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I would remember for a very long time, because it was the first genuinely honest thing she had said since I walked through the hatch. She said, I genuinely do not know what to do with you. I said, that is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long while. In my experience, the best approach when a situation is unclear is to get some food and let things settle. She looked at me. Then, at the very edge of her expression, something shifted, not quite a smile, but the location where a smile might eventually form, given enough time and sufficiently unusual circumstances. Outside the viewport, through the crack, the first rescue ships were arriving. 14 of them, cutting long blue lines through the dark with their running lights, forming a perimeter around the wreckage with the practiced precision of a team that does this routinely. They were coming for her. I was, by their assessment, a problem to be addressed in the appropriate order after the primary concern was handled. I sat down on a piece of debris and pulled out my data pad. I opened a new document. Date, time, coordinates, nature of collision, estimated damage to both vessels, contributing factors including specifically the out-of-date navigation chart. It is simply what you do when something goes wrong. You document it. You build the record from your side. You take responsibility and you make it clear and you do not leave it unrecorded. Elindra watched me. She said, what are you doing? I said, filing an incident report. My insurance carrier will need it. She stared at me. She said, you are the registered paternal witness of a Valthari royal heir in a restricted zone aboard a wrecked vessel belonging to the ruling house of the Sovereign Compact, and you are completing a form. I said, the two situations are not mutually exclusive. She said nothing. The rescue ships docked. Footsteps filled the corridor. I saved my draft, put the data pad away, and waited for whatever came next. I thought about navigation databases and how badly mine needed updating, and about a child whose first recorded witness in the universe was a cargo hauler from Earth who had been trying to go somewhere entirely different. The universe, in my experience, never sends you the problems you expect. It sends you the ones that are actually going to matter. The rescue ships were not subtle. 14 vessels, every single one of them larger than the Halcyon drift, and they formed a complete perimeter around the wreckage in under 3 minutes. The efficiency was genuinely impressive. They held their positions precisely, engines idling at a steady low frequency, waiting. They were not here to escalate. They were here to receive orders from the one person whose orders actually mattered in this situation, and that person was not me. Elindra moved to a communications panel on the far wall that had survived the collapse intact. She spoke into it briefly in Velthari, her voice steady and composed, as if this were a routine briefing. Then she looked at me. She said, "I told them you are a registered independent navigator who entered the zone without knowledge of its restricted status. That is accurate." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I told them the resonance event occurred." I said, "What did they say?" She said, "There is nothing to say. The record exists. There is no response to a record." That was how I ended up, 40 minutes later, in a room on a Velthari transport ship. It was clean and white and had no corners anywhere. Every surface curved. The ceiling arched smoothly into the walls. The walls bent gently inward toward the floor. The furniture was designed to suggest rest without fully committing to it. 2 guards stood outside the door, present but not threatening, the kind of guards whose function is to define a boundary rather than enforce one. A small service drone appeared within the first 10 minutes and offered me food. It was pale green, served in a shallow dish, and smelled of something between fresh mint and metal shavings. I ate it because I was hungry and because refusing seemed impolite. It tasted considerably better than it smelled. I used the transit time. I pulled up everything in the Halcyon Drifts database about the Velthari. The summary was not comprehensive, but it covered the essentials: old species, spacefaring for roughly 8,000 years by human reckoning, a hereditary monarchy that had remained stable for 6,000 of those years, which was an extraordinary record by any standard I knew, population of approximately 4 billion across 9 systems, strong reputation for legal precision and cultural formality. Not historically hostile to humanity, but not particularly engaged with humanity either. We were too new, too recently arrived in the larger map, too small in the current picture to have warranted significant attention. I had just become the most discussed human in the galaxy, for reasons I had neither sought nor selected. The door opened. A figure walked in who was not Elindra and was not a guard. He was tall, dressed in deep gray clothing designed to signal importance without appearing to try, which is always the most expensive kind of design. His skin had the same pale silver-blue quality as Elindra's, but where her face was carefully composed, his was arranged into something that wanted to project calm and was not quite managing it. His eyes had the calculating quality of someone who reads outcomes before they materialize. He sat across the table from me and said, "I am Counselor Davin Reth, Senior Legal Advisor to the Sovereign Compact." I said, "Carter Wells, I haul cargo." He said, "I know. I spent the last 2 hours reviewing your registered history." I said, "Find anything of note?" He said, "You have an unusually clean record for someone operating independently in the outer systems for 11 years. I said, "I follow the rules. It makes the insurance paperwork significantly less complicated." He set a data pad on the table between us. He said, "You understand the legal situation." I said, "Resonance event, biosignature registered, father of record, permanent. Yes, I understand the basic structure." He said, "Then let me explain the political dimension. Under the Compact's foundational statutes, a paternal witness recording cannot be nullified by any mechanism except 2. The first is the Solvari, which is a formal 3-part trial of contested guardianship rights. The second is a classification review of the witnessing party's species." I said, "What does a classification review mean in practice?" He said, "If a species is assessed as pre-sapient or legally non-cognizant under the old statutes, their biosignature cannot hold legal weight in a witnessing event. The record would be declared void." I looked at him evenly. I said, "Someone is going to argue that humanity is not intelligent enough to count." He said, "Someone is already preparing to make exactly that argument." I said, "Who?" He said, "Lord Vincaris, the princess's betrothed." I said, "Oh." He said, He is not at all pleased with the current situation. I said, I imagine discovering that the legal father of record for your betrothed's heir is a cargo hauler who arrived by accident is not a comfortable experience for a person in his position. Davin looked at me carefully. He said, "You are remarkably composed given the circumstances." I said, "I have been in difficult situations before. Composure tends to produce better outcomes than panic, in my experience." He said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Are you aware of what it means in Velthari culture to hold the position of paternal witness to a royal heir?" I said, "Not fully, tell me." He set the data pad down and folded his hands. He said, "You would hold a permanent seat on the Royal Witness Council, which advises on the heir's development and welfare. You would have legal co-guardianship standing, giving you the right to speak in all formal proceedings related to the child's future. You would have an irrevocable right of presence at every significant event in that child's life. And because this child is first in line for succession to the ruling house of the compact, you would be permanently and legally connected to the governance of an interstellar civilization of 4 billion people." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "All of this happened because my navigation charts were 11 years out of date." He said, "That is correct." I said, "I want to file a formal complaint with whatever interstellar body is responsible for maintaining current navigation databases. An outdated chart representing a restricted zone as open passage is a genuine safety issue. If I could enter by accident, someone with less accidental intentions could do the same." Davin stared at me. The stare lasted long enough that it became something more than a pause. It became the specific look of a person who is encountering something that does not fit any category they have ever prepared. Then he said, slowly and clearly, as if testing whether the words made more sense spoken aloud, "You want to file a navigation complaint." I said, "Someone should have updated those charts. It is a documented hazard now. It needs to go through the appropriate reporting channels." He said, "You are the first human to hold a legal position within the Velthari Compact, through a mechanism that has not been invoked in 600 years, in a situation being actively discussed by every senior official in the capital, and your primary concern is submitting a formal database correction request." I said, "I can manage multiple concerns at once." He stood up. He picked up his data pad. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and said, without turning around, "The transport arrives at the homeworld in approximately 40 hours. I recommend using that time to review whatever you can find about Velthari court protocol. You are going to need it." He left without waiting for a response. I went back to my database and found 3 documents on Velthari court structure. They were brief and outdated, but they gave me the general architecture of how things worked. Then I found a longer document on Velthari legal history and read it twice. The homeworld appeared in the viewport on the second day, and I understood immediately why people traveled from across the compact just to see it. It rejected straight lines entirely. The buildings grew rather than being constructed, organic structures that spiraled upward from a plateau above a silver sea, lit from within by a warm light that pulsed in slow, steady rhythms. From orbit, the capital looked genuinely alive, not as a metaphor, as a description. I was escorted down through the atmosphere in a secondary shuttle with 6 guards and no explanation of our destination. The guards were polite and said nothing. I watched the architecture grow larger through the porthole and thought about what was coming and what it was going to require and what I was actually prepared to do. The answer was the same one it always was in difficult situations. Whatever was necessary, in whatever order it became necessary. The court of the Sovereign Compact occupied a chamber near the top of the highest tower. I was led in through a side entrance that opened directly onto the main floor. One moment I was in a corridor. The next moment I was in a room containing hundreds of Velthari officials, advisors, representatives, and observers who had apparently turned out specifically to see whatever this was going to be. Every face turned as I entered. The silence was deliberate and collective, the kind that large groups produce when they are actively maintaining it. The ceiling was transparent. Through it, the planet's two moons hung in the daytime sky like two pale eyes observing the proceedings from outside. I found Alindra at the front of the chamber. She was standing rather than seated, which I would learn was a signal of contested status, and she was dressed in something completely formal that made every aspect of her presence intentional. Her expression was composed in the way of someone who has decided that the world will accommodate itself to them, and not the other way around. Beside her stood Lord Vincaris. He was broad-shouldered, dark-clothed, and wearing the expression of a person who has already decided how the situation ends, and is simply enduring the formality of the process catching up to his conclusion. He was striking the way powerful people in formal settings often are, arranged to fill space, aware that others were watching him watch the room. He looked at me when I entered. His gaze was the assessment gaze of someone calculating the effort required to remove an obstacle, not the attention of someone encountering a person. I looked back at him the way I look at a malfunctioning engine component, neutral evaluation, patient, not worried yet, because worry is not useful until you understand what you are dealing with. The senior court official spoke in Velthari, then repeated the statement in the translated formal record. The matter of the resonance witnessing is formally entered. All parties are recognized. The compact accepts the preliminary record of Carter Wells as the documented paternal witness, pending resolution of all outstanding challenges. Vincaris's jaw moved slightly. I stood in the center of that ancient chamber, under two moons, in front of hundreds of beings who had never seen a human before, and thought about the invoice I was going to have to submit to my insurance carrier, and how long the description field was going to be. Then the court official said, "Lord Vincaris has submitted a formal challenge. The Silvari is called." The quality of the room's silence changed immediately. Not noise, not visible alarm, the Velthari were too composed for that. But a shift, a thickening, the specific attention of a large group that understands something is about to happen that has not happened in a very long time. Alindra looked at me from across the chamber. Her expression was complex and carefully managed. Not pity, not warning, something more precise, an acknowledgement that the structure of the world sometimes assigns situations to people who did nothing to deserve them, and that there is nothing to be done except move through it. I gave her a small nod. I did not know exactly what the Silvari would require, but I had spent 11 years fixing broken ships in deep magnetic storms at the edge of explored space with no backup and no instructions, and I had learned a reliable truth about problems that look impossible at first inspection. At second inspection, most of them are only improbable. The court moved around me. The tide had decided to find out what a human cargo hauler was made of. I stood in the current and waited for the water to show me what it intended. The Silvari did not wait for morning. Vincaris had set the pace for the challenge, and the pace was 4 hours. In Velthari formal culture, delay following a challenge is read as hesitation, and hesitation signals weakness. He was making a tactical decision. Give me no time to prepare. He did not know me well enough yet to know that preparation and readiness are not always the same thing. Davin Reth appeared at my chamber door 90 minutes before the first trial with a data pad, and an expression that said he had not slept. He sat across from me and said, "The Silvari has 3 parts, the trial of mind, the trial of will, and the trial of worth. They were designed 1400 years ago to resolve contested paternal guardianship claims in royal succession disputes. No Silvari has been conducted in 600 years, because contested claims are normally resolved through political negotiation and nobody with an actual choice chooses to run the trials. I said, why not? He said, because they are unpredictable. The trials were designed with Vilthari physiology and psychology in mind. When contestants with different physiologies or unusual psychological profiles enter them, the trials sometimes produce results that do not fit any documented category. The legal handling of undocumented results is complex and precedent is limited. I said, what happens to someone who produces an undocumented result? He said, we are about to find out. He walked me through each trial carefully. I listened and asked specific questions and he answered them. When he finished, I sat quietly for a moment. He said, there is not much time to think. I said, there is always enough time to think if the thinking is efficient. The trial of mind was held in a chamber accessed by a long descending corridor cut directly into the rock of the plateau. The walls were the same pale luminescent stone as everything else in the capital. The chamber at the bottom was circular, roughly 30 meters across, with walls covered in a dense lattice of small lights and speakers and emitters that I could not fully identify at a glance. The whole room had the quality of something that had been built by people who understood exactly what they wanted it to do and had done it well. A young Vilthari attendant explained the protocol. He was clearly nervous, in the way of someone who has been given an assignment that is unprecedented and is aware that he is the one who will have to report whatever happens to someone senior. He said the emitters would activate simultaneously when I crossed the threshold. The signals could not be avoided. They were emitted from all points of the chamber at once. I was required to navigate from the entrance to the center marker, a raised disc in the floor, and stand on it for 10 seconds to complete the trial. If at any point during the transit I could not correctly answer 3 identity questions, name, origin, current purpose, I would be removed. Most contestants took between 20 and 40 minutes. The record was 11 minutes, set by a Vilthari admiral 300 years ago. I said, can I ask something? He said, yes. I said, the signals are designed to cause disorientation, but they do not physically block movement. Is there any rule against walking directly to the center without engaging the signals cognitively? He said, the protocol does not specify cognitive engagement. The signals are emitted. You are not required to respond to them. You are only required to maintain orientation. I said, those are 2 different things. He looked at me. Then he said very carefully, I suppose they are. I went in. The signals were immediate and powerful. I will not understate that. The lights moved in patterns the human visual system is not built to track naturally, coming from peripheral angles that pulled attention sideways and outward constantly. The sounds were layered across frequencies that created a physical sensation of the room shifting around you, walls breathing in and out of position. The vibration came up through the floor and through my boots and into my legs, creating a persistent urge to compensate for movement that was not actually occurring. The scent was sharp and sweet, in a combination that made the brain want to stop and identify the source. I had spent 8 months at a communications relay station that was caught between 2 competing electromagnetic field generators that were slowly destroying each other, and the station along with them. The fields had created constant, layered interference that made thinking in straight lines very difficult and made certain kinds of focus nearly impossible. I had repaired 17 separate systems over those 8 months, alone, with no functioning external communications and no reliable timeline for when the fields might stabilize. The trial signals were similar in structure to that interference, cleaner, more intentional, better designed. But the underlying mechanism, layered sensory input designed to break cognitive orientation by overloading attention, was something I had been living with for 8 months and had learned to work around rather than fight. The relay station had taught me something specific. Fighting interference makes it stronger. Acknowledging it and proceeding anyway dissolves its power over you. The signals want your attention. Give them acknowledgement. Do not give them residence. I focused on the center marker. I walked toward it at a steady pace. The signals pressed against my attention from every direction. My name is Carter Wells. My origin is Earth, third planet of the Sol system, human civilizational territory. My current purpose is reaching the center of this room. The signals were present. They were real. They were not relevant to those three facts. I reached the center marker in 4 minutes and 28 seconds. I stepped onto the raised disc, and the signals cut off completely at the boundary. The silence that followed was the specific quality of silence that exists after sustained constant noise suddenly stops, a ringing, slightly unreal absence. The attendant was standing at the entrance with his communicator raised. He had not spoken since I entered. He was looking at his device, then at me, then back at his device, with the expression of someone who is reading something accurate and is finding it difficult to accept that it is accurate. I said, "Do I wait here or walk back?" He said very quietly, "You wait." He spoke into his communicator in a specific tone I recognized. It is the tone of someone reporting something that happened and making clear that they understand how it sounds, and they are telling it accurately anyway. The previous record was 11 minutes. Nobody said anything about 4 minutes and 28 seconds for a long time. The trial of will took place the following morning. The extra gap told me that Veen Karas's team had encountered the first result and needed time to recalibrate. The trial room was completely featureless, white in every direction, one chair in the center, a technician in the corner with a device on a tray. Davin had explained the trial to me beforehand. The device attached to the temple and located the contestant's deepest fear, not a constructed or symbolic fear, the actual root of it, the genuine source. It held that fear in the foreground of conscious attention, and the trial was to remain seated without leaving the chair for as long as possible. Duration was the measure of performance. The record was 42 minutes, held by Veen Karas himself. I sat down. The technician attached the device to my right temple. It held without pressure. The device activated. It did not show me an image or construct a scenario. It went directly to the source, and it brought the source forward completely, held it open and clear in my conscious attention without any softening or mediation. The fear was not about dying, not about pain or loss of control or darkness or physical harm. It was about a specific cargo run 4 years ago. 3 scientists at a remote research station, stranded when a charged particle storm shifted and blocked their normal route out. I had told them I could get them home. I had said it with confidence because they needed confidence to function, and because I believed it, and because the alternative was something I was not going to accept. For 11 hours I had not known with complete certainty that I was right. The storm had been unpredictable. 3 of my navigation systems had failed partway through. 2 backup engines had run at reduced efficiency. The path through the storm had required real-time recalculation every 40 minutes as the conditions shifted around us. For 11 hours, the full weight of 3 other people's lives had sat on every decision I made. And beneath every decision had been the knowledge that one miscalculation, one wrong assumption, one moment of rushing something that needed more care, would mean 3 people did not go home to whoever was waiting for them. They went home. I got all 3 of them out. The calculations had been right. But the device was not showing me the outcome. It was showing me the 11 hours. The fear, when I reached it and recognized it clearly, was this: I am afraid of failing someone who trusted me with something they cannot replace. I sat with it. I had lived with this fear for 4 years in the quiet hours of long solo runs, and in that time I had never found a way to make it smaller. What I had found was a way to live alongside it. It was not a fear I wanted to eliminate. The fear made me careful. It reminded me that decisions made in space have weight, and that weight falls on people who are depending on me to carry it well. A person without this fear would make casual decisions that cost others. I did not want to be that person. The device held the fear open and present for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours, it deactivated. Maximum duration, the practical limit of the mechanism. The technician removed the device carefully from my temple and looked at his readings for a long time. Then he looked at me. His expression was the expression of someone who needs to report a result and is not certain the vocabulary for that result exists. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You appear unchanged." I said, "I am the same person I was when I sat down." He said, "Yes, that is exactly what I mean." Davin found me afterward and explained that a draw in the trial of will had never been recorded. The trial was designed to eventually overwhelm the contestant. Its maximum duration existed as a practical time constraint, not because any contestant was expected to reach it. The fact that I had remained seated through 6 hours without being overwhelmed, and without the fear itself forcing me out of the chair was, legally speaking, an outcome the statutes had no prepared category for. He said, "The committee is reviewing historical precedent." I said, "What does the trial of worth look like?" He said, "Direct combat, non-lethal but genuinely competitive. Vincaris will send a representative. You are permitted to use your own approach." I said, "All right." He said, "Your approach is not going to be traditional Velthari form." I said, "No, it is not." He looked at me. He said, "That is all I am going to say about that." The trial of worth was held in the open courtyard at the top of the tower under the sky in the afternoon. Both moons were visible above the city, pale against the daylight. The full court had assembled along the courtyard's perimeter. Elindra was there. She watched me enter with an expression that had changed from the chamber below. The calculation was still present, but something else had joined it. The careful attention of someone who has decided that a thing is worth categorizing and is now doing the work. Vincaris's representative was named Soren, introduced with a single translated title, Combat Specialist. He was approximately 2.5 meters tall, built in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime in physical discipline, not bulk for bulk's sake but functional and precise, exactly as much as was needed. He held a ceremonial staff in a grip that was relaxed because it was practiced, the weapon simply an extension of himself. He looked at me with the particular expression of a very large, very trained individual assessing a target and finding the arithmetic comfortable. I had spent 11 years doing salvage work and cargo runs through some of the outer system's less orderly corridors. I had learned to handle physical disputes in airlock-with spaces where there was no room for any technique requiring distance or formal positioning. What I had developed was not elegant. It was efficient. It worked best when the other party was expecting something structured and formal. The attendant said, "Begin." Soren moved into an opening stance with the precision of someone who has executed that movement thousands of times. Weight balanced, feet placed exactly, staff raised in the ceremonial position that was the traditional beginning of Velthari combat form. It was disciplined and composed and completely correct, and it took approximately 3 seconds to fully establish. I covered the distance in 4 steps and went directly for his balance rather than his weapon, targeting the mechanical weak point in the stance he had just committed to. And Soren, who had prepared for every formal response to a formal opening, had no prepared response for no opening at all. 11 seconds after the attendant said begin, Soren was flat on the courtyard floor looking up at the sky with an expression of genuine and complete surprise. He was not badly hurt. He lay there for a moment, processed what had happened, and then sat up with the deliberate care of someone who is reassessing a fundamental assumption. He looked at me. The assessment in his eyes had changed entirely. He was not insulted. He was revising. He stood. He inclined his head in the gesture Davin would later describe as completed acknowledgement, a formal recognition that an engagement had concluded, and the outcome was accepted without dispute. The attendant said formally, clearly for the record, "The trial of worth is concluded. Carter Wells is the winner. The Solvari is decided in full." The courtyard held its silence for what felt like a long time. Vinkaras turned and walked away without speaking, and the sound of his footsteps crossing the stone was the only sound in the space until they faded at the far entrance. I rolled my shoulder, still aching from the instrument panel 3 days ago. Elindra caught my eye across the courtyard. Her expression had completed its shift. The calculation was running different variables now, working toward a conclusion I did not yet have a name for but recognized as the beginning of something real and considered. I gave her a nod. She gave me a smaller one back. I thought, I need to learn a great deal more before I say anything to this child. Then I thought, I have time. I will start with a letter. 3 days after the Solvari, the situation expanded in a direction I had not fully anticipated. I had expected some period of adjustment following the trial. The contested portion was resolved. The record was confirmed. I thought there would be formalities to complete, documentation to sign, some transition period while the compact integrated an unprecedented result into its normal operations. I was not thinking large enough. Vinkaras filed his petition with the Galactic Compact's Standing Committee on Species Classification within 48 hours of the Solvari's conclusion. Before I had finished reading the written summary of my own trial results. The petition was extensive and precisely referenced. It cited statutes that had not been formally invoked in over 200 years, but had never been removed from the legal framework. The core argument was procedural and technical rather than emotional, which made it more dangerous than an emotional argument would have been. He was not claiming humanity was unintelligent. He was claiming that humanity had not met the documented threshold of interstellar civic participation required for legal standing under the Compact's foundational framework. The threshold had been written into law 8,000 years ago when the Compact was first formed, designed as a practical protection to prevent newly contacted species from being accidentally bound by legal agreements they could not yet meaningfully understand or honor. In the context of its original creation, it had been a reasonable and protective measure. In the context of this moment, it was being used as a precision instrument to undo a legal record that had already been decided through the proper mechanisms. Davin explained all of this to me over a meal that I kept forgetting to eat. He was thorough and did not soften any part of it. He said, "The petition has been accepted for preliminary review by the Standing Committee. That does not guarantee success. It means there will be a formal hearing." I said, "Timeline." He said, 6 days. I said, "And if the petition succeeds?" He said, "Your witnessing record is nullified. Your Solvari result is treated as having no legal standing. Your presence in the Compact becomes a matter of diplomatic courtesy only, which means you can be asked to leave at any point without legal recourse." I said, "And Earth?" He set down his data pad. He said, "Under the old statutes, a non-cognizant designation also removes a species' home system from the Compact's protected territorial framework. It would not mean immediate action against Earth, but it would mean any Compact member could operate in Earth's territory without legal impediment from the Compact's protective provisions." I looked at him steadily. I said, "This was never about me." He said, "No, you were the mechanism. Earth was always the target." I sat back from the table and looked out the window at the silver sea. The water was holding the afternoon light in long, flat ribbons. Near the shore, a group of Velthari children were playing at the edge of the water, small pale figures running in and out of the surf, laughing in a way that sounded close enough to human laughter to recognize, but different enough to remind me how far I was from anything familiar. I thought about Earth. I thought about the research stations in the outer systems, and the people running them, and the supply routes I had been flying for 11 years. I thought about everyone who had no awareness that this hearing was being prepared, and no means to affect its outcome. I thought about what it would mean for all of them if the legal framework protecting their territory was quietly removed by a vote in a chamber they had never heard of. I said, Earth is sending a diplomatic team. He said they are already traveling. They will arrive on the 5th day. I said, good. He said, Carter, I want you to hear something clearly. I said, go ahead. He said, what is coming is not a physical trial. It is not a puzzle with maintenance corridors or a chamber you can walk straight through. It is a formal legal and political argument before 7 of the most experienced arbiters in the compact, conducted under strict procedural rules. Your diplomatic team will present the case. They have training and experience for exactly this kind of proceeding. You do not. I said, I understand. He said, I am asking you to let them work. I said, I understand that too. He looked at me for a moment. He was perceptive enough to hear the difference between someone who intended to comply and someone who understood the instruction and was not yet certain what they intended. He said nothing further about it. In the days before the hearing, I reviewed materials from the Compact's public records about the classification statutes. I read the original legislative language carefully, and then read the commentary documentation from the first 2 centuries of the statute's existence. I read 3 historical cases in which the statutes had actually been applied, and studied what the deciding factors had been in each. I was not planning to use this. I was planning to understand it. Those are different preparations. And I wrote letters. The first letter to Alindra had started as a brief formal acknowledgement, and had become, somewhere in the second draft, something more honest. I rewrote it 3 times before sending a version that was practical in its tone but genuine in its content. She replied within hours. Brief, formal in structure, but with a quality to the phrasing that told me each sentence had been considered before it was written. She said the child was developing well, and that the royal physicians had been briefed on human biosignature parameters for monitoring purposes, and had found the relevant research unexpectedly interesting. I wrote back that I was glad, and that if the physicians wanted to establish a connection with human medical researchers, I could likely arrange an introduction. She replied that she would consider it. I wrote again the following day about something entirely different, something small, a detail of the Capitol's architecture I had noticed from my window and was curious about. She answered in more detail than I expected and asked something in return about human construction methods. We exchanged messages for 2 hours. Neither of us mentioned the hearing. Neither of us acknowledged that the exchange had started somewhere very different from where it had arrived. That is how trust begins in my experience, not directly, through the side entrance, through small honest questions answered without performance. The diplomatic team arrived on the 5th evening. Carolyn Marsh was exactly what I needed to see. Composed, direct, clearly excellent at her work, experienced enough to have moved past the stage where difficult situations impress her. Behind her were 2 legal advisors who preferred operational invisibility, and a communications specialist named Owen Briggs who shook my hand and said, "The government is deeply uncomfortable. The public thinks this is the funniest thing that has ever happened." I said, that sounds exactly right. Carolyn sat with me that same evening and walked through the hearing structure completely. The case was strong. Documented human civilizational history covering centuries, legal and governance development, scientific and cultural output, the existing framework of diplomatic agreements with other compact member species. She was going to demonstrate categorically that humanity exceeded every meaningful threshold the old statutes established, even though those thresholds had been written 8,000 years before humanity was known to exist. She said, "I want you present. Your presence matters, but I need you to let us lead the presentation." I said, "I will stay quiet." She started to stand. Then she paused and said, "The Solvari reports were analyzed extensively by our team on the journey here. The trial of will results specifically generated significant discussion." I said, "What kind of discussion?" She said, "The kind that makes people reassess what they believe about human psychology. The Velthari analysts classified your result as either profound courage or a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. Our team thinks it was neither. They concluded it was something specific to the way humans relate to responsibility." I said, "What did they determine?" She said that your primary fear is not harm to yourself. It is failing someone who has placed trust in you, and that this category of fear does not diminish under sustained pressure. It becomes a structural foundation you operate from. I said, "That is a reasonable description." She said, "It means the Velthari will not predict your behavior correctly because they are measuring the wrong variables." I said, "That is useful to know." She said, "It also means you are unpredictable in ways that concern me, which is why I am asking you explicitly to stay seated tomorrow." I said, "I will stay seated." She gave me the same look Davin had given me, the look that registers the words while reserving judgment about the outcome. The hearing chamber was at the lowest level of the main tower, lower than the court chamber, lower than the trial rooms. In Velthari architecture, the gravity of a matter is expressed through depth. This level was for the things that actually mattered most. The 7 arbiters of the standing committee sat in a curved row at the far end of the chamber. Their collective expression was the most controlled neutrality I had ever encountered. 7 people who had spent their careers perfecting the ability to show nothing until a determination was reached. The chamber was at capacity. Every senior Velthari official was present. 6 other galactic species had sent observers. Vinkaras sat to the left with his legal team, arranged and ready, looking like someone who has already written the ending. Elindra sat to the right, looking straight ahead with her hands folded, her posture so precisely composed it looked structural rather than chosen. Carolyn's presentation was excellent. 40 minutes without a stumble. She established the civilizational record, the legal frameworks, the diplomatic relationships, the scientific and cultural contributions, the treaty history. She addressed the threshold criteria of the old statutes directly and demonstrated, category by category, that humanity met or exceeded each one. The arbiters listened, without visible reaction. Vinkaras's team presented their counterargument with equal preparation. Their core position was procedural. The threshold criteria required demonstrated participation specifically within compact civic structures, not an independent civilizational development, and by the specific language of the statute, humanity's participation record within the compact's formal framework was insufficient to qualify. They did not need to call humanity unintelligent. They only needed to say we had not filed the right documents. Procedural arguments are dangerous for exactly that reason. They sound measured and reasonable even when they are being used to accomplish something that is not. The committee asked questions. Both sides answered. It was thorough, careful, and balanced in a way that told me it could genuinely go either direction. Then the lead arbiter said, "Is there any further testimony to enter into the record?" Carolyn looked at me, briefly professionally. The look said, "Stay seated." I stayed seated for 4 full seconds. Then I stood up. Behind me, Owen Briggs made a very small sound. The lead arbiter looked at me. His expression remained perfectly neutral. He said, "This is a formal proceeding." I said, "I know. I apologize for the interruption. I have one thing to say and then I will sit down and you will not hear from me again today." He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "You may speak." I did not look at Carolyn. I looked at the arbiters, one at a time slowly, all the way down the row. I said, "I'm not going to argue about thresholds or participation criteria or statutory language. Carolyn has done that better and more thoroughly than I could. I want to tell you something true instead." I paused for a moment and let the chamber settle. I said, "When I was 12 years old, my father taught me to repair a broken engine in the garage of our house. Not because it needed to be repaired that specific day, because he wanted me to understand that broken things could be made to work again. He said, if you understand how something functions, you can always find a way to restore it. That is what he gave me, not a skill, a way of approaching everything." I said, "On the day I collided with the princess's ship, the first thing I did when I got through the hatch was look for someone who needed help. I did not know who she was. I did not know the legal situation. I did not know what any of it was going to mean. I knew that someone was hurt and I was the person present, and those two things together created a responsibility that I did not need to calculate. I simply recognized it." I said, "I have been in this court for 6 days now. I completed the trials. I have sat in rooms and been measured and assessed, and I have tried to be honest throughout about what I am and what humanity is. I cannot tell you with certainty that we meet every criterion in a statute written 8,000 years before we were known to exist. We are new in this structure. We are still building our presence here. But I can tell you what I observed in 11 years of flying to the outer reaches of what my species has mapped." I said, "Every human I have encountered in 11 years, in stations and ships and outposts in places so distant they do not appear on standard charts, has looked at a broken thing and decided to try to fix it. That is not a metric I can enter into a legal document. It is a characteristic. It is what we carry with us when we go somewhere new." I looked down the row of arbiters. I said, "This hearing is a broken thing. It was constructed to erase a legal record that was already properly decided, to remove a child's father of record before that child has been born. I do not know with certainty whether I will be good at what the law has assigned me. I have no experience with anything like it, but I know that I am going to be present for it. I am going to attend every council session and address every difficult question and be there at every moment that child needs someone to show up. That is what the biosignature registered. That is what I intend to honor." I said, "That is all I have." I sat down. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Owen Briggs leaned forward slowly and said, very quietly, "Carolyn is going to have a significant conversation with you later." I said just as quietly, "I am aware." Carolyn's expression, at the edge of my vision, was the carefully managed expression of a professional choosing not to display a reaction in a formal proceeding. The committee withdrew. They were absent for 2 hours and 14 minutes. When they returned, the lead arbiter's face was still composed, but something at the very edge of it had shifted slightly. Not much. Enough. He said, after full review of all presented evidence, entered testimony, and applicable precedent, this committee finds that the petition to reclassify humanity under the founding statutes of the Compact as legally non-cognizant is without sufficient merit. The standard of proof required to apply these statutes to a species with humanity's documented civilizational record and existing treaty relationships has not been met. The petition is denied. The witnessing record of Carter Wells is confirmed as legally standing. Vinkaras sat completely still. His legal team began organizing their materials with the deliberate, careful movements of people who have lost and are handling it quietly and with discipline. The arbiter continued. He said, "This committee further notes, for the permanent record, that the testimony entered by Carter Wells in these proceedings is formally archived in the Compact's foundational records. It is the first testimony given by a human individual in the Compact's 6,000-year recorded history." He looked at me directly. He said, "Welcome to the record, Mr. Wells." I said, "Thank you." The chamber began to empty in the ordered, measured way of ancient institutions returning to their ongoing work. The voices of hundreds of people rose back to their normal level. The observers from the 6 visiting species moved together in careful groups. Velthari officials dispersed toward their various functions and responsibilities. Elindra found me in the corridor outside the chamber. She came without her guards, which I noted. She stood in front of me in the quiet of the corridor and looked at me with the clearest and most direct expression she had given me since the crash, since that very first moment in the wreckage when she had placed her hand against my neck and understood what had happened. She said, "You were told to stay quiet." I said, "Yes." She said, "You stood up anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "It worked." I said, "Sometimes the most useful thing you can do with something broken is simply name it clearly in front of the people who have the authority to repair it." She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was still and cool and lit in the soft way of the lower levels. Then she said, "The child is going to know that you spoke today. I am going to tell them. When they are old enough to understand what the compact is and what that chamber represents, I am going to tell them that their father of record stood up in the lowest hall of this building and said he was going to show up." I said, "I meant every word of it." She said, "I know you did. That is the first thing about you that I have understood with complete certainty from the very beginning." She held my gaze a moment longer. There was something in her expression that had not been present before, not warmth exactly, not yet, but the deliberate and careful beginning of it. The kind that forms slowly between people who have each seen the other handle something genuinely hard without pretending it was easy. She walked back down the corridor. Her guards fell in at a respectful distance behind her. I watched her go and thought about what she had said and what it was going to require of me going forward. Then I pulled out my data pad and started writing. The letter was not long. It said, "I do not know yet what things you will be interested in or what the world will look like when you are old enough to read this, but I am going to find out as we go, and I am going to be there while we do." I sent it to Elindra's communications address. She replied 40 minutes later. She said, "That is a good beginning." Carolyn found me not long after that. She had the expression of someone who has prepared carefully for a difficult conversation and is still working out the precise opening. She said, "That was not the plan." I said, "No." She said, "It worked." I said, "It did." She said, "I am going to write a report characterizing what happened in that chamber as a coordinated, multi-layered strategic approach." I said, "That is genuinely generous of you." She said, "Do not do it again." I said, "I genuinely cannot promise that." She shook her head with an expression that was trying and mostly failing to remain purely professional, and walked away down the corridor. Owen Briggs appeared next. He said, "Earth is going to lose its composure completely when the full transcript is published." I said, "The government will be uncomfortable." He said, "The public is going to think you are the greatest person alive." I said, "I just needed the committee to understand that we show up." He said, "I think they understand now." I found a window at the far end of the corridor that looked out over the Silver Sea. Both moons were visible in the early evening above the water, their combined light coming down in long pale columns that shifted as the water moved beneath them. The capital breathed its slow internal warmth across the plateau. The towers spiraled upward into the darkening sky. I thought about the halcyon drift, sitting in a repair bay somewhere, my battered ship with its out-of-date charts and its cracked instrument panel, and its 11 years of small accumulated repairs that had kept it functional through every difficult situation I had put it through. I thought about my father in the garage on a Saturday morning, engine parts laid out on an old cloth, explaining each component with the patience of someone who understood that the lesson was not about the engine at all. I thought about a child who had not yet been born and who was going to grow up knowing that somewhere, a human named Carter Wells had stood up in the deepest chamber of the oldest institution in the compact and said he intended to be present. I still needed to file that navigation complaint. The hearing had made it a lower priority, but the underlying issue had not resolved itself. An out-of-date database representing a restricted zone as open passage was a genuine hazard. Other ships could make the same error. It needed to be documented, escalated, and corrected through the appropriate channels. I had a responsibility to the next person who might follow the same wrong route. The paperwork for that complaint was going to be remarkable. I was looking forward to it. I thought about how to begin it. Then I went and found something to eat, because it had been a very long series of days, and I was genuinely hungry. And the fact that the universe had expanded considerably around me in the past 2 weeks did not change the basic requirements of existing inside it. The Silver Sea held the light of 2 moons. The capital of the Velthari Sovereign Compact breathed around me, alive and ancient and preparing for whatever came next. And a cargo hauler from Earth stood at a window in the oldest inhabited building in the compact and thought about a broken engine in a garage, and a father's patient voice, and everything that one small lesson had eventually led to. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a decent outcome for someone who had simply been trying to deliver medical supplies to a research station 6 sectors away. The next letter I wrote was longer than the first. I sent it before I went to sleep. In the morning, there was a reply.